There we go. Nathan Stock is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Prior to joining MEI, he spent 9 years working for former President Carter's organization, the Carter Center. He then moved to Jerusalem to run the center's Israel-Palestine field office. Stock led Carter Center efforts to facilitate the reunification of the Palestinian political system and designed and managed projects targeting the Fatah-Hamas conflict. During the Al-Aqsa Intifada, he lived in the Gaza Strip, working with a Palestinian NGO to design and fundraise for conflict resolution programs targeting the Palestinian community. Nathan, that's quite a bio, and we are very eager to look forward to what you have to say to us today. Welcome, Nathan. Thank you. Now you can go ahead and screen share.
Sure. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with all of you today. Also great, again, to see folks with Northfielders for Justice in Palestine and Israel. I have fond memories of presenting to your group in Northfield some years back. So lovely to be here. This morning, I wanted to take some time to try to put the current fighting between Israelis and Palestinians in a broader historical context, particularly in the context of the evolution of the Gaza Strip over time. We'll talk about that history. We'll talk about the current status of the war, and then we'll consider briefly how all this might get resolved and what the role of international humanitarian law should be in how we think about current fighting and future possible resolutions. I am not sure I'll be able to see the Q&A, so I would just ask you to flag for me as we go if there are urgent questions. I mean, don't hesitate to interrupt me. If anything is unclear, just stop me. If there's things that come up in the Q&A, let me know. Otherwise, we'll have plenty of time for discussion after my presentation. So this is a very simplified timeline of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I want to start here because I think it's important to consider how this rather unusual entity that we call the Gaza Strip came into being in the first place. So on this map, in the kind of, I don't know, grayish purplish color, you see Israel as it existed in its de facto borders at the end of what Israelis call their War of Independence, what Palestinians call the catastrophe. And you see in sort of a pinkish color the outline of what we now call the Gaza Strip, including Gaza City on the map there on the Eastern Mediterranean. The first thing worth noting here is that this strip exists because during that War of Independence, the Palestinian catastrophe, when Israeli forces, the newly declared state of Israel, was fighting conventional militaries from multiple Arab states, including Egypt, Jordan, Syria, there was an Egyptian army around Gaza in this, essentially this salient into Israeli-controlled lines. And when the fighting stopped and they worked out the armistice agreements at Rhodes, Egypt held that territory. And they were allowed to continue to administer it, and it was not included in what became the de facto borders of Israel. Of course, during the fighting, you saw, hundreds of thousands, some 700,000 or so Palestinians displaced from their homes in what became Israel. And crucially, when the fighting ended, it was the policy of the government of Israel not to allow those displaced persons to come home. That policy decision, the prevention of Palestinians displaced in the fighting, whether they were driven out or fled of their own accord, I don't want to get into that debate, but it was government policy, Israeli government policy after the war, that refused to permit these people to come back. When they tried to go back to their ancestral homes, they got shot at. This is the reason why the population of this little place called the Gaza Strip swelled, right? You had hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the fighting from surrounding villages in what became coastal and southern Israel. They fled into this relative safety of Egyptian-controlled territory. And then, of course, when the fighting stopped, they couldn't go back because of this Israeli government policy, and they were therefore made refugees. And they have been hundreds of thousands of people, 2/3 of the population of what is now the Gaza Strip, are the descendants of these displaced persons from southern Israel. That goes back to the mid 20th century now. Okay, so now we have this strange little salient of land that is very crowded with Palestinians, most of whom were displaced from their homes in what's now Israel. I'm going to gloss over a lot of history here, but of course the next big milestone came during the Six-Day War. There was saber rattling from Arab states. Israeli forces launched this surprise attack, and they conquered all the territory on this map in pink, including not just Gaza, but the Sinai Peninsula as well. Another war, this one launched by the Arabs in 1973. And that war was in some ways resolved through the Camp David Accords, the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt in the late 1970s, which saw Israel return to Egypt control of the Sinai Peninsula. So fast forward to, say, 1980, and the Sinai, again, is Egyptian territory, but Israel, all this time, since 1967, has maintained control of this little entity called the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, that is the West Bank of the Jordan River, including East Jerusalem, and then a slice of Syrian territory in the north, the Golan Heights. You may know this, but I'm just covering all my bases. It's important to point out, of course, that Palestinians living in these territories that Israel took in 1967, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, were not made citizens of Israel. They were not then and are not now citizens of the Jewish state. They were therefore under military rule. So they were not afforded the due process under law that a citizen and civilian would enjoy as a citizen of Israel. They were subject to different evidentiary standards. If they were involved in legal proceedings, they were under military law, right? And that was their state. They were in this limbo with very limited rights under hostile military rule. And of course, being under foreign military rule is unpleasant, which led to an uprising by Palestinians beginning in the late 1980s, the first Intifada. And that uprising led to a peace process that launched officially in 1993, something known as the Oslo Accord, since it was kicked off in Oslo, Norway, before being taken over by the United States. And this is important because the peace process, even though it failed, created the physical and geographic architecture on the ground that essentially still persists to this day. So the concept behind the peace process was this idea of a two-state solution, the idea that the Palestinian leadership, the PLO leadership, had made this significant compromise. They had agreed pardon me, that they'd agreed to give up their claims to historic Israel and instead settle for a state only on what they saw as 22% of their historic homeland, the West Bank and Gaza. And in return, they expected to have all of the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, as their state. But the peace agreement itself was phased. It was gradual. So it saw the Israeli military pull its forces out of the major Palestinian population centers in the West Bank. This included places like Bethlehem, Jericho, Ramallah. It saw them pull out of most of the Gaza Strip, but not all. And it left Israeli settlements in these territories not only in place, but allowed them to continue to grow. And so fast forward, the peace process, at least from the Palestinian perspective, is not going very well because settlements keep expanding, and they've realized that they're essentially under a different form of Israeli military control, albeit more indirect, with their population centers encircled by the Israeli military and a series of checkpoints and so on. So you get another uprising in the early 2000s, known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. This leads to something that the government of former Israeli Prime Minister Sharon dubbed the disengagement from Gaza. So throughout the early 2000s, in the second uprising, these Israeli settlements in Gaza were the source of fierce fighting. Palestinian militants targeted this infrastructure. They targeted the military bases around the settlements. They targeted the settlers and vice versa. Palestinian refugee camps in southern Gaza were seriously damaged in the course of this fighting. And it led to a kind of compromise where the government of Israel said, okay, we're pulling these settlers out of the Gaza Strip. They also pulled their forces off of the Egyptian Gaza border, which ostensibly is progress. The thing is, this wasn't done in coordination with the Palestinian leadership. There wasn't really an attempt to make this any sort of concrete step toward a two-state solution. Moreover, and this is very important for understanding where we are today, per the Red Cross, per international humanitarian law, Israel did not relinquish control of the Gaza Strip when it pulled its settlers out of the interior of the territory in 2005. In 2005 and in 2010 and today, you can't get on a boat in Gaza and sail to Cyprus. Gaza used to have an airport. You could, for a few years there, fly from Gaza to Cairo. Israel bombed that airport in 2001 when I was living there and have never allowed it to reopen, right? So Israel maintained a closure over Gaza's coastline, its airspace. They severely restricted the ability of Palestinians to move in and out via Israeli-controlled checkpoints. Because of this control, the international community and the Red Cross maintains that Gaza continued to be, in the eyes of international law, Israeli-occupied territory, even after those settlers were pulled out of the interior of the territory. So for those of you who've perhaps been to Bethlehem or are familiar with the settlement and wall geography around Bethlehem, right? Bethlehem is essentially encircled in a giant concrete wall. The Gaza Strip is essentially the same in terms of Israeli policy and military posture toward the territory. There's been a fence around Gaza since 1999. After the 2005 disengagement, Gaza was just a larger canton. It was like Bethlehem, but bigger, with eventually 2 million people trapped in it, surrounded by a wall, under Israeli control, and largely unable to leave. And this is the penultimate thing I'll say here. The Israeli restrictions on the movement of Palestinians in and out of the Gaza Strip actually go back to circa 1990, 1991. When I moved to the Gaza Strip in the spring of 2000, before the infamous suicide bombings of the second uprising, before the Palestinians were blowing up Israeli nightclubs in the early 2000s, Gaza was already an open-air prison for most of the Palestinians who lived there then. Most people couldn't leave. You could apply for a permit. Some people got them. A lot of people didn't. And then, of course, in 2007, 2006, there were Palestinian elections. Hamas, this organization that's listed by our government as a terrorist organization, also political rivals to the PLO and the main party in the PLO that had long dominated Palestinian politics, they won a plurality of seats and were able to form a government in the Palestinian legislature because of this election victory in 2006. This led to friction between Hamas and the party that lost that election, the party of the current Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, and that erupted into violence in the summer of 2007. And when the dust settled on that fighting after a couple of weeks, you saw the security forces loyal to the Palestinian president and ostensibly allied to the United States being essentially pushed out or driven underground in Gaza. Hamas was dominant in the interior of Gaza, even though Israel still controlled, the things that mattered, movement of people and goods and so on. Hamas was in control on the ground. And in those cities in the West Bank, like Bethlehem or Nablus, where the Palestinian Authority had jurisdiction, the security forces loyal to the Palestinian president essentially won the short civil war, and Hamas was driven underground. So more or less since 2007, you've had this strange reality of dueling Palestinian governments or dueling seats of Palestinian political power, with Gaza being essentially a bastion for Hamas and the cities of the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority has jurisdiction, being a bastion for their political rivals, the PLO and the forces loyal to the Palestinian president. It was in and around this period of civil war. You also around then saw Palestinian militants take an Israeli soldier prisoner in a cross-border raid. That the closure of Gaza in its modern state, the really increased closure, the further restriction, particularly on laborers, restrictions on manufactured goods, restrictions on material imports, really ramped up circa 2006, 7, 8, to get to a point where the sort of the baseline unemployment rate in Gaza began to be around 40, 50% even, at some points higher than that. So this, you can think of this as kind of a gradual increase over time in Israeli restrictions on the economy of this place, the movement of people and goods, such that certainly by 2007-8, Gaza is not a very livable place. Most people can't leave. Most people were dependent on foreign assistance just to survive, to eat, which was not the case even 20 years before that. And then from really 2008 on, we have seen a cycle of wars on and off between Israel and the Palestinian, largely between Israel and the Palestinian organization Hamas in Gaza. There was a war in 2008. There was some more fighting in between there. There was a more significant war in 2014. There was another round a couple of years ago, and then of course the events of last fall and the war we're still seeing today. But I want to emphasize here that the fighting that is going on now is the product of a much wider set of problems and of policy decisions, made largely by the Israeli government, that have kept Gaza in this state of economic misery, keeping the people there largely trapped in an open-air prison, and creating conditions through which some kind of violence, whether instigated by Hamas or other groups, was just unfortunately very likely, because conditions in this place were really awful. This in no way excuses, this cross-border raid that killed, hundreds of Israeli civilians, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. But it does explain the context that got us into the mess that we're in now. But let me pause there. Are there questions? I don't know if it's possible for me to see the participants and to see everybody's video. It's always helpful for me to
Yes,
know.
you should be able to see the Q&A. I texted you on or chatted with you on that. I looked and there are none right now.
Okay.
Oh no, there are two.
I see two here. Yeah.
Yep, there are two.
Why wouldn't Israel? Yeah, I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to talk in just a second about exactly what happened on October 7. And then I think first I'll address Gail's question about restrictions on movement. And then I'll come back, Elizabeth, to your question. So one of the perverse realities of Israel's control of Gaza since 1967, Israel has controlled the territory since 1967, is that Israel's economic interests in Gaza have changed over time. From the late 60s, into the late 80s, circa 1990, Israeli policy vis-a-vis Gaza was to stifle industries or agriculture that might compete with the production of Israeli goods, and instead to move the Gaza economy toward a source of cheap labor that supported Israeli economic growth. So in the 70s and 80s, you saw hundreds of thousands of Palestinians every day, enormous numbers, going into Israel to work, largely as low-skilled or semi-skilled laborers, either on Israeli farms or in the Israeli construction sector. This was the product of very deliberate Israeli economic policies. And if you want to learn more about this, I strongly recommend the work of Sarah Roy at Harvard, ROY. She's probably the foremost US scholar on particularly Israeli economic policies vis-a-vis Gaza, and she delineates very well how it was very colonial in the old sense. You create kind of a captive market for Israeli goods. You don't allow the Gaza economy to produce stuff that can compete with Israeli stuff, and instead you have this nice pool of low-skilled, low-paid laborers, and that's what they did. That is particularly cruel because then Israel began to turn the tap off. They had stifled the ability of people in Gaza to establish their own industries, and instead funneled them into Israel as semi-skilled workers or unskilled laborers, and then they stopped allowing the movement of people into Israel to work. The argument in the Israeli discourse in the early 1990s was that people from Gaza were a security threat. There had been some stabbings of Israelis from one or two people from Gaza in Israel. And there was this sense that they didn't want to have all these Arabs around or Palestinians in Israel moving around and working, doing things. So they began to close off that movement of people into Israel. And of course, this ramped up in the late 1990s. You saw the first suicide bombings, which were connected to Gaza. Certainly, they were instigated by Hamas in circa 1996. And then there was more of a security argument to be made there. But from the perspective of international humanitarian law, Israel is the occupying power. Israel is therefore responsible for the well-being of the civilians under its military rule. Now, Israel also, as the occupying power, can take steps to defend itself and address security threats. That's also legitimate. But the kinds of policies we saw, the stifling of local industry, and then in turn the stifling of this labor pool that Israel itself had created. I mean, these are the kinds of things that an occupying power is not supposed to do. They're not in the interest of the welfare of the occupied civilian population. But it led to a situation in which eventually the vast majority of people from Gaza couldn't leave. So there is a security argument to be made there, and part of that is legitimate, but you can't go so far as to essentially create an open air prison, right? But let's talk more about exactly what happened on October 7. Okay, and this is just a quick map of the Gaza Strip after the disengagement, after the settlements were pulled out. Okay, so on October 7, no one, myself included, anticipated that Hamas would be able to execute the kind of coordinated mass attack into Israel that they pulled off. What did happen, though, was something that in broad brushes, myself and others had warned about and tried to raise attention to in Israeli policymaking circles for years, which was that this basic equilibrium of Israel thinking that it had Palestinians in Gaza contained and that they could get by as, essentially recipients of foreign aid with no political horizon. What happened here in the big picture is that equilibrium was blown up because Hamas, as I and others had warned for years, would see the use of force, including the use of targeting Israeli civilians, as in its interests sometimes to advance its policy goals. And that is at the 10,000-foot level, that's what happened here. Hamas decided that violence was its best course of action. And boy, did they engage in violence. They, in a, it's just what's in the media reporting, right? But essentially, in a very carefully coordinated attack, they knocked out the cameras and the electronic monitoring infrastructure that Israel maintains on the Gaza border. For at least a little while there, some number of hours, maybe a day more, communications, Israeli communications and Israeli military communications on the border that connects the different watchtowers and military bases on the border, that was knocked out. And in that blackout, Hamas was able to lead an assault wherein they breached this very sophisticated high-tech border fence, series of fence and barriers in multiple places, something like 30 places. And once they had done that, some 2,000 armed Palestinians at various points poured into southern Israel and killed approximately, or probably at least 1,200 people. Most of the dead were Israelis, though some not insignificant number were foreign nationals, including Thai laborers working on Israeli farms in the region. Of the dead, the majority, some 65%, were civilians, were non-combatants, although hundreds of Israeli soldiers were killed as well, particularly in a number of military bases that Hamas essentially took over for a brief time. You saw, I think it's been widely reported, just horrifying targeting of civilians, including people at a music festival in southern Israel. There are now numerous confirmed reports of Palestinians engaging in sexual violence against Israeli civilians and seemingly soldiers. And you saw initially some 240 people taken prisoner and moved back into the Gaza Strip. The majority of those were released during a ceasefire earlier in the war, but more than 100 remained detained. Almost immediately on October 7, as Israel figured out what was going on, they began to bombard the Gaza Strip and eventually launched a ground invasion. And now we're in a place where the confirmed Palestinian fatalities are more than 31,000. Approximately 70% of the confirmed fatalities are women and children. More than 72,000 are confirmed injured. It is widely agreed that there are thousands of more likely killed. It may even be as many as twice this number, either between people whose bodies remain trapped in rubble or people who are dying from secondary causes. And there are at least 20 cases now of people who have been confirmed to have died from starvation, mostly children, but also, of course, waterborne diseases are skyrocketing, right? It always happens in armed conflicts like this that over time, as you get more data, you'll see a bump in just general mortality rates that are not direct conflict deaths. And there is some initial reporting that bump in other unexplained fatalities, like a higher number of people that have died in this period than, say, the same period the year before, are almost all also certainly related to the conflict, either because of lack of water, lack of food, disease, etc. And I'm just going to share this next slide, and I'll come back to the previous slide in a moment. But the destruction of physical infrastructure, including housing, in the Gaza Strip is really quite enormous. This is just one interactive map, and I've hyperlinked here, and I'll share these slides. They don't present well on a PowerPoint slide, but there are several interactive features that you can find from various media outlets that you can go on to and see this sort of reconstructed and get a sense of the damage. But it is utterly profound. I mean, and for that matter, Palestinians and Israeli soldiers alike are describing just in parts of the Gaza Strip in particular, a lunar landscape of devastation. The estimates of Hamas fighters killed range wildly. Israel says the latest, Israel says they've killed 12,000 of their fighters. Hamas says the number is half that. Hamas is estimated to have had, or was estimated to have had, 30 to 40,000 fighters on the eve of this war. And then since the ground invasion, since the war, this phase of the war started, you've had at least 247 Israeli soldiers killed. I want to understand what's going on here. I really think it's important to put these numbers in the context of other armed conflicts in the 21st century, right? Our modern military has fought a number of wars over the last few decades, and I don't think it's possible to analyze these conflict deaths in the context of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, and also simply to think about the morality of what's happening here without putting it in this broader context. So just a few numbers that I would put out to all of you. The first thing to note is, so 70% of the dead at this point, the confirmed conflict deaths, are women and children. That is not to say that the other 30% of confirmed dead were all militants, right? There were, most of the men if there are 2.2 million people in the Gaza Strip and Hamas had 40,000 fighters, that means the vast majority of people in the Gaza Strip, period, are non-combatants. The vast majority of the males in the Gaza Strip are non-combatants, right? But if you take the low-end estimate that 70% of the dead are women and children, let's assume those are all non-combatants. That means you have, at this point, nearly 22,000 confirmed women and children killed. That's in 5 months. 5 months, 22,000 women and children killed. In 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the United States and our coalition allies confirmed killed approximately 12,400 civilians. So it is a virtual certainty. Again, if you account for the other conflict deaths here, it is a virtual certainty that in 5 months, Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip have killed twice the number of civilians as all the civilians that the United States killed in 20 years of war in Afghanistan. And mind you, there are 2.2 million people in the Gaza Strip versus Afghanistan, where the population is much, much larger. Another stat I would just note here is that we are now in a situation where, according to the World Health Organization, 90% of children in Gaza under 5 are suffering from one or more infectious disease. 70% are experiencing diarrhea-borne diseases. This is a 23-fold increase over the baseline from last year. The number of children killed in the 5 months since October the 7th is approximately the same as the total number of children killed in all the armed conflicts in the world in the previous 4 years, between 2019 and 2020. So let me say that again. All the other armed conflicts in the world, Ukraine, other places, right? In 4 years, the confirmed deaths of children is the same, approximately, as the number of confirmed deaths of children in this tiny space with 2.2 million people in it over the last 5 months. This context points to how to think about the legality and morality of what is happening here. And this is where international humanitarian law is very important. So let me advance my slides. Okay. International humanitarian law is a fancy term for the laws governing armed conflict. This is an idea that is actually very old. I mean, there are references in ancient texts, Islamic texts, the idea that in warfare, you can't do just anything. That there are protected persons or protected things that you can't harm. It's a very old idea. Modern international humanitarian law goes back to the early 20th century. It is best enshrined in the Geneva Conventions as updated and finalized after World War II. There are several of them, right? The Fourth Geneva Convention specifically details protections of civilians under military occupation, protections of civilians in armed conflict, right? As I alluded to a moment ago, Palestinian civilians prior to this war, are still considered to be under an overarching umbrella of Israeli military control, and therefore should be afforded certain protections by the Israeli military and certain care. And certainly when you're in the case of a hot armed conflict, Geneva Conventions and other sources of law prescribe things that combatants can and cannot do. And the key ideas here are this concept of distinction and proportionality. So distinction means that anyone who's a fighter in a war has some obligation to try to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. People who are combatants and non-combatants, but also objects, places, buildings, hospitals, houses, right? You have to make a reasonable effort to distinguish who's who. And of course, targeting combatants is perfectly reasonable. Targeting military bases and fighters is fine. And you are, in general, not supposed to directly target civilian things. However, to be clear, it's not black and white. The Geneva Conventions do not say, thou shalt never bomb a house. You can, if you are a military fighting a fighter who's your enemy, and that fighter is shooting at you from somebody's house, you can shoot back, and you may damage that house. You may even a civilian in that house. But this is where the second key concept comes into play here, which is proportionality. So you, the fighter, be it in theory, be it a Hamas fighter or an Israeli soldier, you are supposed to consider the harm to non-combatants against the importance of the military objective. And in general, the more you're going to harm a non-combatant, the more it better be really important, right? So, and again, I apologize. It's not black and white. It's complicated. This is why, Slobodan Milosevic was on trial for years in trying to adjudicate questions of war crimes, right? It's not simple. These are things that need evidence and real legal procedures to truly adjudicate. But they are also supposed to be guiding principles that people with guns in wars are supposed to try to abide by, right? So what's the idea here? Well, in this war, of course, we've seen a lot of talk about hospitals. The Israelis are saying, Hamas is using these hospitals as bases. They have all these tunnels under hospitals. And it's very clear that, yes, Hamas has lots of tunnels in Gaza. There's no question about that. There's at least some evidence that some of those tunnels are under hospitals. Also, that much is clear. So then what do the Geneva Conventions say in all this? Well, what it says, what it would mean in practice, what it's supposed to mean is, yes, there is a scenario in which an Israeli soldier could enter a Palestinian hospital, but they better have a darn good reason, right? This, a hospital has a particularly protected status, right? And this is where, this to me gets to, and I'm going to stop talking at you in a second here. This is where I find these concepts and the comparison to other armed conflicts fought by other modern militaries, especially ours, very useful in understanding the morality of what's happening here. I don't think it's useful to simply say good guys and bad guys. There have been these arguments made by some activists since October 7th that, well, Palestinians, this, famously made the news from, I guess, some students at Harvard or something, Palestinians are fighting an anti-colonial struggle, and in an anti-colonial struggle, there are no civilians. So essentially, I guess the idea is whatever they do is legitimate because they're fighting an anti-colonial struggle. I don't agree with that. And the Geneva Conventions definitely don't support that. There are civilians in Israel. There are non-combatants in Israel. There are non-combatants in Palestine. And neither side in any armed conflict globally is allowed to deliberately target them, especially if there's, no good reason, right? And so when you look at what Hamas initiated around October 7, this attack that they carried out, it is very clear that some Palestinian fighters, now there's some room for debate about which fighters did what, because there are a lot of guys with guns in the Gaza Strip. Not all of them are Hamas, and there's an argument to be made that we could get into this if you want to in the Q&A, but I suspect that more of the atrocities against Israeli non-combatants were committed by other Palestinian armed groups. Whatever. The bottom line is, if you're a Palestinian who goes into, enters Israel with a gun, you can't deliberately target civilians, period. Similarly, in all of these cases where, just from media reporting, not to mention, initial investigation by experts in international humanitarian law, I recommend Google the Swedish organization Diakonia. They put out an initial investigation of IHL violations by both sides through, mid-January. That's quite comprehensive. Again, given the data the limitations of the data we have now. And surprise, surprise, they find clear patterns of certainly of Palestinians around October 7 and then Israelis ever since violating these basic principles of international humanitarian law, violating the Geneva Conventions, deliberately targeting non-combatants and using excessive force, disproportionate force when doing so. So it is by this standard that I think, based on the data we have, it is fair to say that what's happening here now is a travesty. What Hamas did on October 7 is horrifying. They are an occupied people. Per the Geneva Conventions, a Palestinian fighter has a right to shoot at an Israeli soldier, and an Israeli soldier could shoot at an armed Palestinian. Hamas definitely cannot lead an attack into Israel that results in, mass slaughter of civilians and rape. Definitely not acceptable. Israel, now seemingly having destroyed or damaged 70-80% of the structures in the Gaza Strip, having killed tens of thousands just of children, that strongly suggests a pattern of disproportionate use of force that is unduly harming non-combatants. And if you dig into, again, with the data we have now, which is not perfect, there would appear to be clear reasons why, right? So one of the things that has come to light in some of the reporting on this is that Israel has engaged in a pattern of using very large munitions, right? At least in several cases in October, as an example, they dropped 2,000-pound bombs in the Jabalia refugee camp. Spent a fair amount of time in Jabalia. It's crowded. It's real crowded. Surprise, surprise, it's a Palestinian refugee camp. If you drop a 2,000-pound bomb there, you're going to kill dozens, if not hundreds, of civilians. And anyone with half a brain could know that, right? So anyone who makes a decision to use a munition of that size knows they're going to kill huge numbers of civilians. It is, the New York Times has done some interesting reporting on this. It is interesting to read the expert analysis of people who study, munitions and air campaigns and patterns of use of force. And they note that the US, for example, in our air campaign in and around Mosul, Iraq, when we were leading this air war, supporting the Iraqi government, and fighting the Islamic State in Iraq. We rarely dropped bombs bigger than 500 pounds because we were really trying not to kill the civilians still trapped in Mosul, right? As U.S. military sources have gone on record as saying Israel has lots of bombs that are smaller than 2,000 pounds. They're not using them. They are using often large munitions that inevitably, in a place as incredibly crowded as the Gaza Strip, is killing civilians in astounding numbers vis-a-vis the population. Another last stat I would throw at you here is the percentage of women and children killed in this war between Israelis and Palestinians is even enormously lopsided compared to previous wars that Israel has carried out in Gaza. So you go back to the last major armed conflict in 2014, and the percentage of the confirmed conflict deaths when the dust settled after 6 weeks in that case was something like 35–40% of the dead were women and children. Now it is reversed. So it is clear to me, based on the data we have, that there is a pattern of targeting and disproportionate use of force that is harming non-combatants. And this explains in part why the International Court of Justice, in this not quite the same thing, but it contributes to why the International Court of Justice found a month or so ago, initial evidence to suggest that Israel, in the case of its conflict in Gaza, may be violating the convention even against genocide. It's worth reading the convention. There's a convention on this, kind of like the Geneva Conventions. I think Israel signed it in 1951. It's really worth reading because it makes clear that the way genocide is defined by the International Convention on Genocide, which Israel signed, we signed, it is even incitement to genocide, an attempt to destroy in whole or in part a group of people, an entire population, can be considered genocide. And the International Court of Justice was careful to say we are not, again, these things are complicated, right? We have not had the time, we don't have access to the data, the evidence needed to make a final determination, but they at least were willing to make a preliminary statement based on the data they had that called on Israel to change its behavior in its conduct of the war out of concern that genocide could be occurring. Okay, so let me pause there, and I just want to take a quick look at the Q&A. Okay, I see a question about Senator Schumer's. Okay, great question about the potential for the U.S. to pressure Israel. And then Elizabeth. Role of Israeli military on October 7. Yeah, we can talk a little bit about that. A reason to expect the U.S. to support sanctions against Israel. I'm reading Alan's question.
Nathan, when you settle on a question to respond, I'll read the question so everybody knows that as a preface, okay?
Sure. Let me take Elizabeth's question first, and then we'll go to Alan and Ariel because they're kind of linked.
Okay, the first question from Elizabeth, could you give an objective description, that one?
No, we've
second
addressed that. Elizabeth Burr from 1034.
What about the role of the Israeli military on October 7th? Are you aware of the work of Jonathan Cook and others reinvestigating the details of that day?
I don't think I know Jonathan a little bit. I don't think I've seen his writing on this. I will say there's been some pretty interesting reporting about the objectively profound lapses in first of all in Israeli intelligence analysis well before October 7. I mean, they, by any objective measure, they really screwed up here, and the screw up goes way back before October 7. They essentially fundamentally underestimated for starters, that Hamas would try something of this magnitude. And I don't mean to blow my own horn here, but I spent a number of years, working for former President Carter's nonprofit, trying to alert policymakers in Israel that the status quo was violent, and that Hamas, based on my many hours of interviews with them and negotiations with them, like, they would use force. They would try to use force when they saw it as being in their interest to do so. And that's what happened here. And beyond that, they carefully planned this attack, and they very deliberately exploited certain Israeli vulnerabilities. They waited to do this on a holiday. They were careful to they had good intel. They apparently had maps of some of these military bases. They knew how to knock out their communication. So it's clear there's a cascade of not just military failures by Israel on October 7, but upstream failures in their own analysis and planning. But then let's go to Alan's comment, and then you could read Alan and then read Ariel.
All right, Alan asks, the US also violates Geneva Conventions with remote drone strikes on civilians. Is there any reason to expect that the US would support sanctions against Israel? If not, is the US complicit in the violations because we provide the arms?
Yeah, and you might as well read Ariel's question too.
Recently, Senator Chuck Schumer gave a speech very critical of the Israeli government. What are the possibilities that the US makes enough pressure to the Israeli government to induce a way towards peace?
Yeah, so I think the United States, since the 70s, certainly since the 1990s, because of our close relationship with Israel, has had a unique level of complicity, and I would say even culpability, in Israeli human rights violations. We give an enormous amount of military aid to Israel every year. We have for a very long time. And Israel, in turn, for decades, has denied Palestinians their right to self-determination, but also, in the conduct of their military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, engaged in a pattern for decades of violating the Geneva Conventions. The settlements, just set aside for a moment the horrifying war grinding on now, the settlements, the 700,000 Israelis living in what should be the West Bank, that is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. And we have continued to shovel money at Israel for decades and decades, despite them doing these things that violate international law, but that we also say we don't want them to do. We say, stop doing that. And then we give them more money and weapons. So, yeah, I don't know how else to slice it. As an American, since we live in a democracy here, and we supposedly get to set the policies of our government, we are complicit. And it is unusual, right? China is doing horrible things, particularly in Xinjiang, to the ethnic Uyghurs there. But we don't underwrite half the Chinese defense budget. So as bad as that is, it's not really our fault. This is different. Which leads then to Senator Schumer's speech and the million-dollar question of whether or not the United States will actually take action, emphasis on action, to try to get to the policy outcomes and the behaviors from our erstwhile ally that we say we want to see. So not only did Senator Schumer give that speech, but you've had several senators, led notably by Vermont Senator Sanders, who I would note is Jewish, call on the Biden administration to enforce existing US law, right? This isn't rocket science, guys. Globally, there are supposed to be strings attached when Uncle Sam gives you weapons. You're not supposed to be able to use American weapons to violate human rights. As Senator Sanders and several other senators have noted in a recent public letter to the Biden administration, there is ample evidence, as we were just discussing, that Israel is using American munitions to engage in a pattern of violations of the Geneva Conventions, of a disproportionate use of force, and of targeting non-combatants. Therefore, it should be an open and shut case that they're already violating US law. We're not supposed to be able to give them weapons when they do that, but it requires a finding, some statement, something from the executive branch, right? The executive branch is supposed to administer the law, right? And the Biden administration has not pulled the trigger on that. So this gets to Ariel's question, and this is what is so maddening to me about this, and just, I mean, it's a little bit, honestly, at this point, it's mystifying, right?
Mm.
First of all, as we've discussed, Palestinians are dying, civilians are dying, people who had nothing to do with this horrifying attack have died by the tens of thousands. They are starting to starve to death. Number one. Number two, this horrible thing that is happening in no way benefits the United States of America, right? I happened to be in the Gulf. I was in Qatar back in December, and I got an earful from Arabs, various people who speak Arabic as their first language, Palestinians and others. And it is impossible to overstate the damage that is being done to US interests in the region and globally, right? We say, the Biden administration says, we're in a competition with Russia. Why wouldn't we be? They've invaded Ukraine. They're doing a lot of bad things. We say we're in a competition with China. Again, legit, China got a lot of concerns about that. This thing we're doing, throwing our lot in, essentially from day one of the horrifying Hamas attack, and essentially from day one, messaging as though we backed any Israeli response to the Hill, is profoundly harming other American national interests. It makes it harder to compete with China. It makes it harder to address Russian aggression in places like Ukraine. These are all things the Biden administration says it cares quite a bit about. And yet, the president himself, and based on everything I've read and everyone I've talked to, it does seem to be a problem with the president. Buck stops at the top, right? He can't seem to bring himself to go beyond lip service. Then there's the fact that, oh, by the way, just out of curiosity, if President Biden, as he suggests, cares about getting reelected and not ushering in a second Trump administration, this is harming him politically, profoundly. So by any measure, by his own making, President Biden has dug himself in a hole. He has tied himself, in effect, to Israel's war aims. And this is where, and I do want to get back to one last slide to talk about how we make it out of this mess, and then I'll stop again and we'll just take some more discussion. But this gets to how we get out of this and where this is all headed, right? So from the beginning, if you'll recall, Secretary of State went to Israel, President Biden showed up not long thereafter, and the tone of the communication from the government of the United States was, Israel, this awful thing has happened to you, which is true, objectively, very awful. Again, violation of the Geneva Conventions, like out the wazoo, attacks against civilians, all very bad. But the tone of the American messaging from the get-go was, we are with you 110%. Whatever you got to do, we're there. And to me, I mean, looking at this from afar, that was profoundly stupid. Profoundly stupid. I mean, it's now quite clear, based on media reporting and other sources I have, that the U.S. Imagine this. I got to go on a soapbox about this for a second. The U.S. Secretary of State went to Cairo from Israel right after the October 7 attacks, and essentially passed on to the government of Egypt the Israeli request that Egypt open its border and allow potentially millions of Palestinians from Gaza into the territory. Think about this for just a second. This is the US government advocating to a key American ally, whatever you think of Egypt, they're an important ally in the region, to make the Palestinian refugee problem, this thing that our government has called a final status issue, something we've always said we got to resolve it if we're ever going to have peace in the Middle East. This is the US government telling a critical Arab ally, let's make this 70-year-old policy problem of what to do with these Palestinian refugees, let's make it bigger. Let's make it harder to solve. Let's just parrot the thing that Israel wants, which is displacing, all these Palestinians into the Sinai Peninsula, right? Into a place, by the way, the Sinai Peninsula has had an insurgency going on for 10 years now. It's not exactly Canada. It ain't stable, right? Like, this is profoundly stupid. From the get-go, the Biden administration's orientation seems solely focused on Israel's perspective. And of course, Israelis were traumatized. They were traumatized. They've encountered this incredible historic trauma. No surprise there. Very understandable. They wanted revenge. I get that too. But the role of the United States in this should not have been to simply encourage them to give into their worst instincts. It should have been to be a more thoughtful, impartial third party. And we didn't do that. We didn't do that. And then suddenly we're surprised. Like, it's like, oh, now we just know, oh, wow, look what happened. 30,000 people have died, the vast majority of them civilians. The Israelis are starving them. It's profoundly harming our interests in the region. And now the president of the United States is, asking them to tone it down a little bit. And yet, even now, he is not seeking to implement relevant US law that would actually constrain what Israel did with our weapons. So let me forgive me for getting a little hot under the collar, because this is where, besides the fact that I have friends in Gaza who are starving now, and their kids and their grandkids are almost certainly starving because of these things that as a US citizen, I am at least partially complicit to, I'm particularly animated by the role that our government plays in this, as I am supposedly a citizen here with a say, right? This is the part that really galls me as an American. So how do we get out of this? Well, you got to address all these underlying issues that have been left to fester for decades at this point. Drivers of violence in Gaza, the closure of Gaza, the long-running inability of Palestinians to just have a functioning economy, right? You got to address that, right? October 7 is proof of the thing I warned about for years, that just keeping the place sealed up is a recipe for further violence. In order to reopen Gaza, you have to address the fact that as I alluded to in the beginning of my remarks, that there's this long-running split within the Palestinian political system. They were supposed to have had elections years and years ago. None of their erstwhile elected officials, they, nominally have sort of a parliament, even though they don't have a sovereign state. They're supposed to have an elected president. The terms in office of all those people expired years and years ago. They need elections, right? They need elections so that you could have some kind of internal Palestinian leadership that has some legitimacy, right? The Biden administration, saying they want to see the Palestinian Authority, that is the sort of the government that we're more allied to, that's based in the cities of the West Bank, they want to see them take over in Gaza. At the same time, the Biden administration says, well, we have concerns about President Abbas. We have concerns that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. Well, yeah, no kidding, because, Abbas has become a dictator, he in his own fiefdom, and he, has stifled Palestinian democracy such as it is. And Hamas in Gaza, where they had jurisdiction, did the same thing. But the way out of this is not to just parachute or, force some authoritarian Palestinian Authority back into Gaza. You got to have elections. You got to, do the democracy thing, which again shouldn't be rocket science. But then there's a wider question of, okay, you've also got to have a political horizon for both peoples. Again, what did October 7 teach us? It's that the status quo is not sustainable. If anybody wants it, I published an 80-page paper once called "There Is No Status Quo: Drivers of Violence in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict" with the Middle East Institute. This is horrifying proof of everything I've said for years. See, for both peoples, they need a way forward where both people can enjoy political and civil rights and live in some modicum of safety and prosperity. In order to do that, you've got to have a few things in the mix here, and these goes to the questions that came up in the Q&A. You've got to, on the one hand, have some menu, some matrix of carrots and sticks through which the United States and our allies, the international community, incentivizes the Israeli policy decisions we say we want, like, right, for starters, a ceasefire, a comprehensive ceasefire. We say we want that. Israel is not doing it, right? So you've got to have carrots and sticks on the table. Again, I mean, a basic step is conditioning the way, at least the way Israel uses U.S. supplied munitions, maybe further conditions on military aid, but you could go much further than that. The Biden administration has taken a couple baby steps toward, blacklisting people in the settlement movement. You could go a lot further in, like, ensuring that goods produced in Israeli settlements can't be marketed in the US, right? So, and at the same time, you could show Israel positive benefits. Here are the good things. You want normalization with the Saudis. Well, okay, maybe you can have that. But you've actually got to give the Palestinians their rights in some way or another, either through an independent Palestinian state or through some unitary state where everyone has equal rights. So to get to that, you've got to have, the United States government has to treat the Israeli-Palestinian conflict like we treat other threats to peace and security, right? Pick a thing over the last few decades, Yugoslavia, right? In the 90s, we look at sanctions, we look at, bringing a matrix of tools together to get the parties to do the things we want them to do. And we've never done that with Israel. We've just, at least since the 1990s, we've asked them nicely, we've fretted when they haven't done what we wanted, but we have never meaningfully tried to use the many levers at our disposal to incentivize the behavior we want. And then you've got to get the parties to some kind of, and within all that, you've got to, I was going to say two last things and then stop talking. You've got to unpack the pernicious narrative in Israel that really goes back to 2000, that there's no Palestinian partner. There was an attempt at a final status agreement. There were talks at Camp David in the summer of 2000. The talks failed. And Bill Clinton did lasting harm to peace in the Middle East when he blamed the Palestinians for the failure of those talks. And he did so inaccurately. And despite promising the Palestinians that he wouldn't blame them. And then, this second Palestinian uprising broke out a few months later. And so there was this narrative seared in the Israeli consciousness that we gave the Palestinians everything they could ever ask for. We gave them this generous peace offer. And not only did they reject it, but they began to murder our children with suicide bombings. And, aspects of that are true. It is true that, Barak put forward this offer that was better than what they'd had on the table before, but it certainly wasn't equivalent to, giving the Palestinians a free country like Israelis enjoy. And yes, it is true that Palestinians, did terrible things in the first uprising. They did terrible suicide bombings, but it was not the Israeli narrative that has really dominated their political discourse for 20 plus years, that there is no partner. We offered them peace. They tried to murder us instead. That has been the narrative ever since. And obviously, the events of October 7 have only made that much worse, right? I mean, it's not surprising, right? I mean, the Israelis are profoundly traumatized. And frankly, for that matter, so are Palestinians. They also, are in no mood to imagine any sort of shared future with Israelis. But that is part of what the US and our allies must help them with, right? And it's not impossible. But you've got to think about the optics, the messaging. You've got to think about, the grand symbolic gestures. Who can come to Jerusalem, come to the Knesset, address Israelis, show them there's a different horizon. Bring, American and Arab leaders who could do that, even maybe some Palestinians. Line up the Israelis who could make similar gestures to the Palestinians, right? And ultimately bring together this matrix of carrots and sticks and messaging and optics to get them to some kind of negotiated agreement. That's the only way out of this. They have to find a way to live together. And because the power imbalance between the two sides is so lopsided, they can't get to it by themselves, right? The Israelis are powerful enough that they don't have to accede to Palestinian demands. There's no foreseeable situation in which they will. But the Palestinians are not so weak that they can be wiped out, and they are powerful enough themselves that they can inflict certain violence on the Israelis from time to time. So if this conflict system is not worked on by a whole bunch of other outside actors that can change that equilibrium, this horrible, violent equilibrium that is, in sort of its worst form right now, this is going to go on for the foreseeable future. And that would be a tragedy for both sides, especially when our government has so many tools that it could bring to bear if we, frankly, if we cared for Israelis and Palestinians the way we say we do. Let me stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to open the Q&A. Do you want to just read some questions out to me, or what do you
Yes,
want to do?
yes, I see one by Mary. Why no mention of Hamas's deliberate choice to embed itself among civilians in schools, churches, hospitals, etc., so that Israel would have to kill civilians in order to go after Hamas? And I have a question that I have been noodling around for days. Where are the men if the women and children, is it just the sheer numbers of the number of children versus husbands in the families? That's why why the numbers killed are so lopsided, women and children versus men.
Sure, we can talk about that. Did you want to maybe read out a few questions? Maybe I can group them together.
There's the next one is from Lucia, and she says, when I visited Israel, Gaza, and West Bank, I was interested to learn about the rights and responsibilities of Palestinian citizens of Israel. I believe I recall being told that Israel, with universal conscription, quote, of citizens, including women, into its military, did not allow Palestinian citizens of Israel to serve in the military. What other restrictions limit Palestinian citizenship? That's a big question. And I'm not sure if Lucia wants to have that answered in terms of Gaza or just in general, or it kind of mixes up Israel with Gaza, so I'm not sure.
We can talk about that. Let's take the first two questions. Hamas being embedded among civilians. So I think the way this is described in some media reports, certainly the way it's described by Israeli government outlets, is not accurate. It is not accurate in large part because Gaza is just super crowded. It is incredibly crowded. You go, 5 blocks in any direction, and you're going to encounter a school or a hospital or a mosque or civilian homes. So there, I don't think it is accurate to say that Hamas is simply deliberately putting itself in these civilian places in the hope that Israel then won't bomb them because they're next to a hospital. It's more complicated than that. It is that the place is incredibly crowded. If the estimates, the Israeli estimates, are true that Hamas has, say, 40,000 fighters, there are 2.2 million people in the Gaza Strip. 40,000 fighters. So the harsh reality is the vast majority of the people living in this place are civilians. The vast majority of the buildings and you're talking about a place that is almost entirely at this point, one sort of continuous urban sprawl. There are some rural areas on the edges of Gaza, sort of on both edges of the border in some spots, but a lot of it is continuous urban sprawl with houses and schools and all that, right? So if you're going to have some Palestinians with guns, like some Palestinian fighters, there's no way around them working in proximity to civilian stuff. Now, you could make I suppose you could make a different critique that says, well, in that case, the Palestinians should just unilaterally disarm. They can't fight a war without being in proximity to civilians. Therefore, they just shouldn't fight, period. I suppose you could make that argument. Maybe it's an ethical argument. But, international law would say, well, no, they are under military rule, and they, do have a right to shoot at the soldiers who are controlling them. So this is why these questions of Geneva Conventions and proportionality, this is why these questions are complicated. it is objectively hard. It would, in any scenario, even if Israel were making more of a real effort to not harm civilians, which I think the data suggests they're not, it would be, in fairness to them, it would be objectively hard to fight Hamas in Gaza without harming civilians. It'd be impossible. The question is, frankly, how much of an effort are they making? And again, the fact that a third of the confirmed fatalities in the last war were women and children versus 2/3 now is just clear evidence that Israel is not trying as hard as it used to try to not harm non-combatants. Okay, the question about the lopsidedness of the numbers, part of what you're seeing there is also the fact that the age distribution, if you just look at those age cohort graphs, right, it skews very young. Most of I think the majority of the population is under 18. So again, if you're in an armed conflict, and this appears to be the case based on the evidence we have of essentially just disproportionate use of force, you're just bombing, then the dead are going to reflect the age and gender distribution of the people who live there, which is exactly what's happening. One other related point I would make here is, the estimate of the number of armed Palestinians who penetrated into Israel on October 7 is 2,000. That's Israel's estimate. The 2,000 fighters approximately went into Israel, killed Israelis, the majority of them civilians. That's 2,000 people. Let's take the generous estimate, right? Any military needs a rear, you need support staff, right? Think of Hamas as a military. They certainly had supporters who weren't, frontline fighters, but who were involved in their attack. Let's say that's 3,000 more. Let's say 5,000 people in Gaza were in some way involved in the October 7 attack. That's still 2.2 million people that had nothing to do with this, that had no say in it, right? The number of people in Hamas who made the decision to do this thing, I'm just guessing based on my experience negotiating with Hamas, probably 5 people, right? Now you can blame, please, by all means, blame those people. In an ideal world, they would somehow be brought to justice. But the point I want to impress here is that there are over 2 million people who had nothing to do with this at all, had zero say in it, right? Hamas is not exactly a democracy in Gaza. They beat people up for protesting about lack of electricity in a place where power cuts are a daily occurrence, right? So the people that are dying here are innocent. I mean, the vast majority of them. Yes, I mean, some Hamas fighters have been killed. Israel has a right to target them. That's different. But the thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians that have been killed here are utterly and totally innocent of any crime. Sorry, other questions? Oh, sorry, and the question about Palestinian citizens of Israel. Yeah, so it's a somewhat different topic, but yes, I mean, 20% of the citizens of Israel are of Palestinian origin. They are Christian and Muslim. These are people who managed to stay in what became Israel when Israel's War of Independence ended. They were under military rule until 1966. So they were not immediately made citizens, but in 66 they were. And that means that they can vote. They, unlike Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, they can vote in Israel's national elections. They do have representation in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. There are Arab or Palestinian legislators in the Israeli political system. They can also travel. They can move around. They can travel, into the West Bank. They can travel throughout Israel. And again, most Palestinians in the West Bank have quite limited restrictions on their travel. They can't enter Israel or Jerusalem. So a Palestinian citizen of Israel has a lot more privileges and rights than, say, a Palestinian in the West Bank or much less Gaza. That said, it's not my expertise, but there's a whole body of research that it digs into ways in which non-Jewish citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens or Arab citizens, whatever you want to call them, are effectively second-class citizens. There are significant restrictions on where they can buy land or own property. there's just much less public investment in their communities. They just have lousier infrastructure, schools. There have been some changes to that in recent years, but historically, I mean, an analogy is, kind of a version of the Jim Crow South, albeit with some voting rights. There's plenty of evidence that yes, they are citizens, but it is not a level playing field. But other questions that I haven't addressed yet. And you're muted if you're talking.
Sorry
There
about
you
that.
go.
I always forget. I'm going to wrap up with this one because it seems like a good end. You are so knowledgeable about this topic. Do you still have connections to the State Department in any way, or anyone in Washington who would listen to you?
Oh, I've been involved in some conversations over the last few months. I'm um, I'm not overly optimistic, uh, uh, because based on whatever context I have, but just the media reporting also, the president of the United States, at least until recently, has believed he was doing the right thing. And he, by all accounts, is very stubborn and seemingly highly resistant to um, treating this threat to peace and security like we would other similar threats, engaging Israel like we would any other state that receives U.S. military assistance. Um, Senator Schumer's remarks are noteworthy. President Biden's seeming sort of endorsement of those remarks are noteworthy. But yeah, Prime Minister Netanyahu is a survivor. He's not going anywhere unless and until the United States takes action, not words, action that makes it harder for Israel, in this case, Prime Minister Netanyahu, to keep doing what he's doing. And we could do that. So far, President Biden doesn't want to. And it's harming everybody, including Israelis. I mean, we are essentially abetting their worst instincts. And if we say they're our ally, we say that we want them to be peaceful and prosperous, this is not the course of action they should be on. Much less Palestinians. But let me stop there. So in short term, no, I do have some context, but I'm not super optimistic. I do hold out the hope, though, a general hope that this could get better, only because history is full of other examples of peoples locked in terribly violent, generations long conflicts that have gotten out of these things. And I don't, with the right help, especially from the United States, I think Israelis and Palestinians could also get out of it. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Hope is all we have sometimes, isn't it? I'm
Yeah.
sorry to those who asked questions. There are always more questions than we have time for. We have a very informed audience, and for that I'm grateful, because we, the audience, it's up to us to put extra and additional and continuing pressure on our lawmakers to affect change. It's the only thing we can do at this point, and there's strength in that. So that's a reminder. I have posted a very, very short evaluation link in the chat box. Please take just a couple minutes. I'll keep the webinar open for a few minutes for you to do that. It really helps us in how we determine our future speakers and how we move forward. I thank you once again, Nathan, for your ability and willingness to speak to our audience, and for your continued work in this area. It's tough work. You have personal contacts and connections in Gaza, and I know it's a difficult subject for you. So we appreciate your input. I've also posted a link for you to donate to Middle East Peace Now if you like what you have seen and heard and want to support the work of Middle East Peace Now. We do pay honoraria to our speakers. They fully deserve it, and that requires money, of course. So please consider posting. Any amount will make you a member of Middle East Peace Now. Our April forum will take place via Zoom on the 27th of next month and will feature Alan Brownfield. He's an author and a frequent contributor to the Washington Report. Alan will address the issue of Zionism, anti-Semitism, and what it means to be Jewish. Alan himself is Jewish. That promises to also be an excellent forum, as they all have been. And finally, if you're new to, I guess I already said that, so I think we are done. Nathan, any final comment from you before we sign off?
Well, I thank you again for the invitation. It's such an honor and a delight to address your group, and more generally, I want to thank all of you for engaging on these issues, for caring, for tuning in, for engaging your representatives, our American policymakers on these questions. It's enormously important.
Thank you. All right. Thank you to all who attended today. And as I said before, I will keep this webinar open so that you can complete our survey. Thank you so much. Have
Thank
a great
you.
day, everybody. Bye-bye.